Rome built the greatest empire the world had ever seen. Roads that crossed continents, aqueducts that moved rivers, armies that never lost a war for 500 years. And they couldn't figure out how to house their own people. Sound familiar? Overcrowded cities, skyrocketing rents, landlords who collected money and fixed nothing, buildings so dangerous they collapsed on the people sleeping inside them, families crammed into single rooms with no water, no sanitation, and no way out. This is not a story about modern cities. This is Rome, 2,000 years ago. And the crisis they faced was so severe that emperors had to intervene, laws had to be written, and the entire architecture of the city had to change. The Romans had marble temples, heated bathhouses, and the most advanced engineering in the ancient world. And millions of their citizens were one bad landlord away from sleeping in the street. Before we get into it, quick question. Have you ever felt like the place you were living in was held together by luck and neglect? Drop your answer in the comments. Oh, don't forget to like and subscribe. But only if you genuinely liked it. Let's get into it. Here is a number that should stop you cold. By the 4th century, Rome had roughly 44,850 insulae and only 1,781 private townhouses. One city, 1 million people. And the ratio of apartment blocks to private homes was more than 25-1. Rome was not a city of homeowners, it was a city of renters. The domus, the grand private townhouse with its courtyard, its mosaic floors, its garden, belonged to the elite. Senators, wealthy merchants, men whose names appear in history books. For everyone else, for the soldiers and the craftsmen and the street traders and the slaves who had scraped together enough coin for a room, there was the insula. The word itself means island. And that is exactly what these buildings were. Towers of brick and concrete rising from the streets of Rome, surrounded on all sides by roads and alleyways, packed so tightly into the city that they seemed to crowd out the sky. They rose like islands from the urban landscape, each one its own self-contained world of commerce, noise, cooking smells, and human desperation. Rome was a vertical city, not in the modern sense of steel and elevators and penthouse views. In the Roman sense, going up meant going down in the world. The best apartments were on the ground floor, larger rooms, access to water. The higher you climbed, the worse it got. Smaller rooms, less light, no running water, no way out if something went wrong. An entire family might share one room on the 5th floor of a building that had no plumbing, no heating, and no guarantee it would still be standing by morning. The insula was the Roman answer to an impossible problem. How do you put 1 million people inside a city that was never built for that many? You stack them, you rent them a room, and you charge them whatever the market will bear. Rome invented the rental economy long before anyone had a name for it. And like every rental economy that followed, it worked beautifully for the people collecting the money and brutally for the people paying it. But to understand why the stacking never stopped, you have to understand the pressure building from outside the walls. Migration never stopped. It accelerated. Every road the Romans built was also a road people could walk into the capital on. Soldiers discharged from campaigns in Syria and Britain, traders following grain ships up the Tiber, freed slaves looking for work, provincials chasing opportunity in the city that ran the world. Rome was the gravitational center of an empire that stretched from Scotland to Mesopotamia, and that gravity pulled people toward it constantly and without mercy. The city walls did not expand to meet them, the hills could not be flattened, the Tiber cut off. Expansion to the west, and the wealthiest families had already claimed the most desirable land, their private townhouses sitting behind walls on the best ground in the city, taking up space that could have housed dozens of families. So builders did what builders always do when demand is high and space is limited. They went vertical. The economics made it irresistible. Every floor added was more tenants, more coin, more profit. And because demand never dropped, rents never dropped either. People needed somewhere to sleep. They paid what they were asked because the alternative was the street. Strabo, writing during the reign of Augustus, noted the building boom directly. He observed that Rome had become a city of tall structures, rising higher than the available land should reasonably have allowed. Augustus himself was so alarmed that he began attempting to regulate it, which tells you everything about how far out of control it had already gotten before anyone in power decided to pay attention. But regulation is always a response. It is never a prevention. And here is what the profit motive ignored every single time. Height without modern engineering is not ambition. It is a gamble. And the people paying for that gamble with their lives were not the landlords collecting rent from the ground floor. Insulae were not monuments. Nobody was building them for posterity. These were investments. The goal was maximum rentable space at minimum construction cost, and that logic had consequences that showed up in the worst possible way, often without warning, in the middle of the night. The ground floors were solid, brick and concrete, built to last because the shops at street level were generating income that needed protecting. But the upper floors, timber frames, mud brick, lighter materials stacked on top of heavier ones, not because it was safer, but because it reduced the load on the structure below and cost less to build. Every corner cut on the upper floors was money in the landlord's pocket. Every wall built thinner than it should have been was a risk transferred entirely to the tenant living behind it. Vitruvius, the Roman architectural writer, noted that Rome had so little available land that builders could not make their walls thicker even when they knew thinner walls were dangerous. There was simply no room. So the buildings cracked, walls shifted, foundations settled unevenly under loads they were never designed to carry. And sometimes the whole thing came down. Collapse was not a rare catastrophe in Rome. It was a known risk, a background noise of urban life. The poet Juvenal described living in a Roman apartment block with barely concealed horror. Buildings held together by nothing more than the landlord's willingness to paper over the cracks and keep collecting rent. You do not legislate safety unless safety has already failed. Augustus imposed a height limit of 20 meters on private buildings, not because he was cautious, but because buildings had been coming down and people had been dying. Trajan later reduced the limit to 18 meters. Each new restriction was not a precaution. It was an admission that the previous limit had not been enough. Rome did not get ahead of the problem. It chased it, and the people it chased it for were already dead. And the people dying in those collapses, the people most exposed to the cracking walls and the shifting foundations, were precisely the people who could least afford to be anywhere else. Because in Rome, the building itself told you everything about your place in the social order. You did not need to ask someone how poor they were. You just had to count the flights of stairs they climbed to get home. This completely inverts the way we think about cities today. In modern buildings, height means luxury, the penthouse, the view, the extra zeros on the price tag. In Rome, it meant the opposite. The higher your floor, the harder your life. Height was not status. Height was punishment. The ground floor was where you wanted to be. Ground-level apartments were the largest in the building. They had direct access to the street, which meant access to the fountain, the market, the bakery. Some ground-floor units even had running water piped in directly from the aqueduct system, a luxury so significant that it set those apartments apart from everything above them. The rooms were wider, the ceilings higher, the light better. Wealthier tenants took these units and paid premium rent for the privilege. Now start climbing the stairs. Each floor up was a negotiation with discomfort that got worse with every step. The rooms got smaller, the ceilings dropped. The walls got thinner because the building tapered slightly as it rose, reducing weight on the structure below, but giving residents less and less between themselves and the outside world. Windows were smaller or absent entirely, leaving upper floor apartments in a permanent half-darkness, even in the middle of a Roman summer. In summer, the upper floors trapped heat with nowhere for it to go. In winter, there was no heating system built into the walls, no fireplace, nothing except whatever small brazier a family could afford to burn in the middle of their single room, filling the space with smoke and the constant risk of setting the whole floor alight. Water did not climb stairs in Rome. If you lived on the 5th floor, you carried every drop up yourself from the fountain in the street below. Every jug of water for cooking, cleaning, and drinking was a trip down and a trip back up with weight in your arms. And when you needed to use the toilet, you had a chamber pot. And when the chamber pot was full, the fastest solution was the window. Juvenal warned that you should make your will before leaving the house at night, because what came out of the upper windows of a Roman insula could kill you. The architecture of the Roman insula was not neutral. It was a diagram of inequality made from brick and timber. Every floor you climbed told you exactly where you stood in the city. Not just physically, socially, economically, permanently. The building did not hide the hierarchy. It was the hierarchy. And on top of everything else, those upper floors were one spark away from losing everything they had. Fire was not an occasional risk in Roman urban life. It was a permanent condition. Timber upper floors packed with families burning small braziers. Narrow streets so tight that 2 carts could barely pass each other. Buildings sharing walls, sharing roof lines, sharing the same dry summer air that turned every spark into an opportunity. When fire started in a Roman insula, it did not stay there. It jumped. It climbed. It moved across rooftops faster than people could run. The Great Fire of 64 CE under Nero burned for 6 days. It destroyed or severely damaged 10 of Rome's 14 districts. Hundreds of thousands of people lost their homes. Nero's response reshaped the city. Streets were widened. Timber construction on upper floors was banned. Builders were ordered to use fireproof stone. Internal courtyards and colonnades were mandated to slow the spread of flames. Tacitus recorded all of this directly, but Nero did not create the fire brigade. Augustus had done that 60 years earlier. In 6 CE, he established the Vigiles, a force of around 7,000 men divided across the city's 14 regions. They fought fires, enforced fire prevention, and patrolled at night. Augustus did not do this out of compassion. He did it because fire in a dense neighborhood of poor and desperate people was a recipe for riot. Hungry, homeless, frightened people did not sit quietly in the ashes of what used to be their home. They looked for someone to blame. And in Rome, that blame traveled fast and landed at the feet of whoever was in power. A burning insula was never just a building on fire. It was a warning that the city was failing the people who lived in it. And emperors who ignored that signal did not stay emperors for long. Now here is where the story gets more complicated. Because everything described so far, the collapsing walls, the fire risk, the vertical inequality, the political panic, can make Roman housing sound like one vast unplanned disaster. A city that simply grew too fast and too carelessly for anyone to manage or control. But that is not the complete picture. And it is worth stopping here to complicate it. Rome was not blind to design. The insula was not a slum by default. It was a building type. And like any building type, it existed on a spectrum. At the bottom of that spectrum were the crumbling, overcrowded fire traps that Juvenal complained about. At the top were structures that were genuinely sophisticated pieces of urban architecture. Buildings that showed exactly what Roman engineers could achieve when profit was not the only consideration on the table. The best evidence for this comes not from Rome itself, where so much was built over and rebuilt across centuries, but from Ostia, the port city at the mouth of the Tiber. Ostia froze in time in a way Rome never did, and what archaeologists found there rewrote assumptions about how Romans actually lived in apartment buildings. The insulae of Ostia were organized around courtyards, not cramped internal shafts barely wide enough to let a sliver of light reach the lower floors, but genuine open spaces that gave the building a center. A place where residents crossed paths going in and out, where children moved through during the day, where the building breathed instead of suffocating the people inside it. These courtyards served as light wells, pulling daylight into apartments that would otherwise have had none, but they also served a social function. They were the shared space of the building, the place where the community of the insula actually happened. Ground floors were almost universally commercial. Shops, tabernae, opened directly onto the street. A bakery, a wine cellar, a cobbler. sometimes a fuller cleaning cloth in large stone vats. The building was not just housing, it was a piece of the city's economic fabric, woven directly into the street and the life of the neighborhood around it. You did not leave your building to access daily life. Daily life was built into the base of where you slept. This was mixed-use development 2,000 years before urban planners invented the term. Residential above, commercial below, public space at street level. The logic is identical to what modern architects argue for when they talk about livable, walkable cities. Rome arrived at it through necessity and density, not through planning theory, but the result was functionally the same. The Casa Giardino, the garden houses of Ostia, show how far this could go. Originally built in the 2nd century CE as a luxury apartment complex, the structure rose to 4 floors around a central garden courtyard. 16 units on the ground floor alone. Light, space, intentional design. A building that took the Insula form and pushed it towards something genuinely livable rather than merely tolerable. Rome knew how to build well. The knowledge existed. The engineering existed. The craftsmanship existed. It just did not always get applied, because applying it cost more money than the minimum the market demanded. The market rewarded speed and volume over quality and safety. And the tenants who could not afford the garden houses ended up in buildings where the courtyard was an afterthought and the upper floors were a fire waiting for its moment. Which brings us to the question this entire story has been building toward. If Rome understood the problem clearly enough to sometimes solve it, why did the crisis never go away? Housing crises do not begin with shortages. That is the comfortable explanation, the one that makes the problem sound like a natural disaster, something that simply happens when too many people arrive in the same place at the same time. But Rome did not have a housing crisis because it ran out of land or ideas or engineering capability. It had a housing crisis because the incentives of the people building and owning housing were never aligned with the needs of the people living in it. And no amount of imperial regulation fully closed that gap. Landlords in Rome made more money building higher and maintaining less. They collected rent from tenants who had no alternatives and no legal protections worth mentioning. They repaired what they had to repair and ignored what they could get away with ignoring. When buildings failed, the consequences fell on the tenants, not the owners. When fires spread, it was the upper floor families who had nowhere to run. When collapses happened, it was the people in the cheapest rooms who were buried. Regulation arrived only after disaster made it politically unavoidable. Augustus did not cap building heights out of foresight. He capped them because buildings had been falling down, and the political cost of inaction had become higher than the cost of intervention. Nero did not rebuild Rome with wider streets and fireproof stone out of concern for tenants. He did it because 10 of his 14 districts had just burned, and he needed to demonstrate control over a city that had just shown him how quickly it could slip out of his hands. That sequence, profit over safety, disaster, reluctant regulation, should feel familiar. Because it is not a Roman sequence, it is a human one. It repeats whenever housing becomes a financial asset before it becomes a social necessity. Rome had overcrowding, and so do modern cities. Rome had rents that rose faster than the wages of the people paying them. Rome had buildings constructed to the edge of what was structurally defensible because the financial return justified the risk to everyone except the tenant sleeping inside. Rome had inequality written directly into its architecture, visible in every staircase climbed, permanent and legible, and impossible to ignore. The Insula was not a failed experiment. It was a rational response to the pressures acting on it. It housed 1 million people in a city that had no business holding that many. It gave landlords returns that made construction irresistible. It gave the state a way to manage urban density without having to solve the underlying problem of why so many people were crowding into a single city with nowhere affordable to live. Rome did not solve its housing crisis, it managed it. Built better in some places and let it collapse in others. The technology changes, the tension does not. Rome was a city of genius. It built roads that still exist, concrete that heals itself, aqueducts that defied gravity. And yet most Romans went to sleep each night in buildings that could burn, crack, or collapse before morning. That contradiction is not a footnote to Roman history. It is the centre of it. The housing crisis is not modern, it is urban. It appears whenever enough people concentrate in one place and the people who control the space they need to live in discover that desperation is profitable. The problems we call modern are often older than the empire itself. Rome left us roads and aqueducts and the arch, but it also left us this: a warning written in brick and timber and collapse. Some things were never ancient at all. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.